to Real World Science.
Real World Science. Real World Science.
In this program, we're going to learn to think just like scientists, using a process called the scientific method.
Real World Science. Real World Science. Science in the real world.
You may not realize it, but you think like a scientist every single day. Here's how. Whenever you ask a question and then explore the possible answers, you're using the types of skills that scientists use in trying to understand our world. That's what scientists do. For example, scientists who study dinosaur fossils, called paleontologists, ask questions about how dinosaurs lived and died. And they search for answers to their questions in the fossils they dig up from the ground. Scientists who are involved in space exploration pose questions about how people will react in the weightlessness of outer space. They perform tests and experiments to find the answers. Scientists who study creatures that live under the sea, called marine biologists, observe sea animals. Through their observations, they hope to find answers to questions about life in the ocean. You see, it is the job of scientists, no matter what area of science they work in, to ask questions and explore possible answers. And that's something everyone does. Take, for example, George. It's lunchtime, and he poses the question,
What kind of sandwich do I have for lunch?
How does George begin to answer that question? Well, he begins to gather information using one or more of his 5 senses. First, George smells the sandwich. Next, George looks at the sandwich. Based on his observations, he's able to come up with a possible answer. Scientists call this educated guess a hypothesis.
It smells like ham, and looks like ham, and there's cheese. It could be a ham and cheese sandwich.
George's hypothesis is that he has a ham and cheese sandwich. How can he be sure? He can experiment to test his hypothesis.
This tastes just like the ham I had the other day, and I taste American cheese.
Was George's hypothesis correct? Well, here's his conclusion.
I was right. It's a ham and cheese sandwich.
Now, George trying to figure out what he had for lunch isn't quite as complicated as a scientist unlocking the secrets of the universe. However, the process of finding the answer is very similar. They both use the scientific method, a step-by-step process that scientists have developed to help them solve problems and test new ideas. Now, there are different forms of the scientific method, and the order of the steps is not always the same for each problem. But for our purposes, we're going to cover the basic steps that scientists follow when performing a scientific investigation, also known as the research method. Here's the scientific method step by step. Step 1. Define the problem or question. Step 2. Gather information. Step 3. Form a hypothesis. Step 4. Experiment. Step 5. Make observations and analyze data. Step 6. State a conclusion. We can use the scientific method anytime we need to solve a problem or test a new idea. For example, David just started a paper route. There were no streetlights on his route, so David held a flashlight to help guide him along the way. One very rainy morning, David had to take an umbrella along on his paper route. He realized it was very awkward to hold the flashlight and the umbrella and deliver the newspapers too. When he tried to hold the flashlight in the same hand as the umbrella, David dropped the flashlight and it broke. So, for the rest of the paper route, David couldn't see very well, and he stepped in lots of puddles. David had a problem, and he needed to come up with a solution. So, he used the scientific method. The first step was defining the problem.
I can't hold the newspapers, flashlight, and umbrella all at the same time.
Next, he had to gather information. So, he looked through a catalog that had different types of lights, and he saw some with clips that could be attached to different objects.
Maybe I can attach a light to the umbrella so I can have one hand free to deliver papers.
David thought that if he attached a light with a clip to his umbrella, he would be able to see in the dark while he delivered his papers. And that was his hypothesis. Next, David had to test his hypothesis by performing an experiment. So, he made a light that looked like the one in the catalog by fastening a clip to a flashlight. Then, he attached the flashlight to his umbrella, he turned off the lights, and tried walking through the dark room, observing what happened as the experiment went on. With the flashlight attached to the umbrella, he could see where he was going, and he still had a hand free to deliver papers.
Attaching a flashlight to my umbrella solves my problem.
David finally concluded that his hypothesis was correct. He thought that attaching the flashlight to his umbrella would solve the problem. So, he tested his idea, and the results of his experiment supported his hypothesis. Let's review those steps again. Step 1. Define the problem or question. Step 2. Gather information. Step 3. Form a hypothesis. Step 4. Experiment. Step 5. Make observations and analyze data. Step 6. State a conclusion. So, we've seen the scientific method in action when it comes to answering everyday questions. But how is the scientific method used to explore the world of science? Well, it works very much the same way. You've been to see a doctor before, right? Well, a doctor is a kind of scientist too. And just like any good scientist, doctors use the scientific method. For example, let's say a patient goes to see her doctor because she is sick. It's the doctor's job to diagnose a problem to find out what treatment will work best. Let's start with the first step.
What seems to be the problem?
Well, my head really hurts. And I think I might have a fever, and my body aches all over.
Well, the flu has been going around. Sounds like you have a lot of the symptoms. You might have the flu.
So, the doctor gathered information by asking her patient a question and made a hypothesis based on that information. She thought the patient might have the flu based on what the patient told her. But the first hypothesis is not always the correct one, and sometimes you have to repeat steps in the scientific method to come to a correct conclusion. So, the doctor decided to look into the problem a little further.
Let's take a closer look to find out why you're sick.
When the doctor diagnoses the patient, she gathers information about the problem by observing the patient's symptoms. The doctor uses her sense of sight to see whether the patient's throat is red or irritated. Then, she uses her sense of touch to feel the patient's neck to see if the patient has swollen glands. And the doctor listens to the patient's heartbeat and breathing. She also uses a thermometer to see if the patient has a temperature.
Well, you do have some flu symptoms, but I also saw some white splotches in your throat, and that's usually caused by strep bacteria. So I don't think you have the flu. I think you might have strep throat.
So, the doctor made a lot of observations. Then what did she do? Well, she formed a hypothesis. Based on her observations, she came up with an educated guess as to what is wrong with the patient. In this case, The patient's throat is red with white splotches, and she has a temperature. So, the doctor thinks that the patient might have strep throat. How does the doctor know whether her hypothesis is correct? She tests the hypothesis by performing an experiment. The doctor takes a sample from the patient's throat, then sends it to a lab where they will test the sample for strep bacteria. Using a microscope, the lab technician will observe the sample to see whether the strep bacteria are present.
Well, you do have strep throat. Now I'm going to prescribe some medicine to take care of the infection, and hopefully with the medication and some rest you'll feel better in a couple of days.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
The lab experiment showed that strep bacteria were present, confirming the doctor's hypothesis. So, the doctor concluded that the patient had strep throat and gave her the proper medication for her illness. Let's take a closer look at how the doctor used the scientific method to diagnose and treat her patient. First, she gathered information about the patient's symptoms. Based on what she was told, she came up with an educated guess, or hypothesis, the patient might have the flu. Then, she gathered more information by examining the patient and realized her first hypothesis was incorrect. So, she came up with a new hypothesis. The patient probably has strep throat. Then, she tested the hypothesis by doing a lab test for strep throat. She observed the test results and analyzed the data. Finally, she came to the conclusion that the patient did indeed have strep throat. You don't have to be a doctor or a rocket scientist to use the scientific method. And you can even perform real scientific experiments. One winter day, Julie and Melissa were watching the weather on television.
Here in the town of Shoreline, the temperature is below freezing. Many of you will be happy to know that the Shoreline Pond is frozen and open for ice skating.
Great, now I can go ice skating.
And over at the Shoreline Beach, the temperature is also below freezing, so there won't be any swimming anytime soon.
Wait, if the pond water is frozen, why isn't the ocean frozen?
See that? Julie performed the first step in the scientific method. She defined her question. Now Julie and Melissa had to come up with an answer. So, Melissa went one step further and started to gather information, not from books, but from her brain, by remembering things she had learned in school about different bodies of water.
I'm not sure, but I know that the ocean is salt water and the pond is fresh water.
Maybe it's the salt that makes the ocean water take longer to freeze.
And just like that, Julie and Melissa came up with a hypothesis. Salt water takes longer to freeze than fresh water. But how can they know for sure? Well, they could test their hypothesis by performing a scientific experiment.
We can try doing an experiment with some salt and water and put it in the freezer.
Let's try it.
So, Julie and Melissa set up their experiment. They decided that they would try freezing 3 cups containing equal amounts of water and vary them by adding salt to 2 of the containers. They would only test one thing or factor in the experiment: salt. The factor being tested is known as a single variable or experimental factor. When doing an experiment, it's important that you only have one variable. That way, you know that the variable is what causes changes in the experiment, nothing else. To ensure the success of your experiment, always measure carefully, so that all the factors, except your variable, are exactly the same. In the first container, Melissa added 1 teaspoon of salt to the water. And in the second container, she added 2 teaspoons of salt. The third container was just water, and that was their control. When you have a control, you're doing another experiment. The difference is that the control experiment is missing the variable. However, It is exactly the same as the experiment with the variable in every other way. The control helps show the importance of the missing variable. Let's go back to Julie and Melissa's experiment. After they prepared the salt and water mixtures, they put a popsicle stick into all 3 containers. That way, when the popsicle stick couldn't move anymore, they would know the water was frozen. They put all 3 containers in the freezer and observed them every 15 minutes to see if the water had frozen. Each time they checked the containers, they recorded their observations. Here's what they found out.
The water that had no salt froze in 15 minutes.
And the water that had 1 teaspoon of salt froze in 45 minutes. And the water that had 2 teaspoons of salt froze in 75 minutes.
The more salt we added, the longer it took to freeze. I guess we were right.
Yeah, salt makes water take longer to freeze.
And there you have it. Julie and Melissa used the scientific method and came to the conclusion that salt makes water freeze at a slower rate. All they had to do was use the scientific method to come to a logical conclusion. Did you notice how Julie and Melissa wrote down the experiment and their observations on paper? The observations that they recorded are known as data. It's important to outline experiments and record data so that other people can study your experiment and repeat it the exact same way to confirm your conclusion. When enough scientists repeat an experiment lots of times and have enough evidence to support a hypothesis, then it becomes known as a theory. A theory is a hypothesis that has been tested many times and is supported by data. So, why is it important for scientists to use the scientific method? Well, for one thing, it's a logical way for them to come to conclusions about the world around them. But it sets forth a standard that all scientists can use to understand and compare each other's information. And the more people we have working together to answer questions about the world around us, the more we can learn. As you've seen, you don't have to be a scientist to use the scientific method. Anyone can use the scientific method to come up with answers to all kinds of questions. Like, when the refrigerator door is closed, does the light really go out? Or why does soda make you burp? Use the scientific method and find out.